Welcome to episode 9 of the Indeed podcast, where we engage with leading experts working in evaluation and preventing and countering violent extremism to advance knowledge, understanding, and practice in evidence-based evaluation. I'm your host, Kai Brand Jacobson. In today's episode, we dive into a topic which should be important for all practitioners, researchers, and policymakers in the field, discussing with Gazbiah SANS on gendered approaches to evaluation, how to embed gender evaluation in initiative design. This is one of the longest podcasts in our series. In a wide-ranging interview, I discuss with Gazbiah her background and how she initially got started in the field, her experience working with USAID on addressing Boko Haram issues in Cameroon and with the World Bank in Afghanistan, and what we need to do and do better to improve our engagement with gender, both in evaluation and in PCVE initiatives in the field. I'll give a fuller introduction and background to Gazbiah and her work in the interview, and we'll also discuss together how to address gender inclusion and mainstreaming within fragile and conflict-affected contexts. The discussion centers on embedding gender evaluation in initiative design, enriched by Gazbiah's insights gleaned from frontline efforts to integrate gender perspectives effectively into PCV strategies and evaluation in the field. In the Indeed project, we work to integrate gender together with ethical, societal, and legal aspects into every stage of evaluation and initiative design. You can find more practical tools for this in the Indeed online evaluation tool available at indeedproject.eu. The Indeed project and the Indeed podcast series are made possible with generous support from the European Commission. For now, though, I invite you to enjoy and dive in with me to a wide-ranging and rich discussion with Gazbiah SANS, Director of PCVE Works and an inspiring practitioner and researcher in the field. Welcome to another edition of the Indeed Knowledge Series video interviews on evidence-based evaluation and evidence-based policy and practice in the preventing and countering violent extremism and de-radicalization fields. I am very excited and tremendously glad to have with me today a special guest, Gazbiah SANS. Gazbiah, welcome to the Indeed Knowledge Series.
Thank you very much, Kai, for this wonderful opportunity to share my thoughts and my ideas with the larger community, and particularly with Indeed, and hopefully we can build and improve on any of these ideas and thoughts. Thank you.
Well, I look forward to doing that. I have always found it such a pleasure and a wonderful experience when having the opportunity to speak with you and to interact with your work. So very excited to now do this and be able to bring forward your work for colleagues and practitioners in the field through this Indeed Knowledge Series. Now, before we dive in, I'd just like to introduce you a little bit. Gazbiah, you're the Director of PVE Works. You are a preventing violent extremism and counterterrorism expert specializing in gender inclusion and gender mainstreaming, specifically in fragile and conflict and violent contexts. You have more than 15 years experience in the field. You've been with USAID in Cameroon working on Boko Haram and the affected Lake Chad Basin region, with the World Bank also in Afghanistan. You were the former chair and a current member of the internal review panel for the Global Community Engagement and Resilience Fund, the global fund dedicated to preventing violent extremism. And you are also serving as a core member of the Christchurch Call Advisory Network. So you have a very extensive background and experience in the field.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
Today, we are focusing especially on a topic that we have brought forward as being incredibly important to work on evaluation in the Indeed project, and that is focusing on robust, authentic, and effective engagement with gender inclusion and gender mainstreaming, and looking at what does it mean to gender mainstream in preventing violent extremism and counterterrorism. But before we dive in to actually discussing, I'd like to ask if you could share with us, how did you get into this field and how did you get into working, and perhaps first especially looking at gender-based violence in the context and the fields of terrorism and violent extremism? How did you get into this work in the first place?
So that's a very good question. So thank you. I started, I guess it started post 9/11, growing up in the US as a young person and growing up Muslim as a young person in the US. My family was immigrants at the time. So seeing my dad and brother, my brother is 10 years younger than me. So I was 17, he was 7. We went to visit my grandpa, who was very ill in Texas, and we bought last minute tickets. And my dad and my brother were racially profiled, pulled aside because of their names. And it was all really, this is when I think the whole world kind of shifted to look at terrorism and how to counter it or prevent it. And it became something that stuck with me. It was so sharp and it jolted me in a way that I felt there's a disconnect with how Muslims are being perceived versus what some bad actors done in the name of Islam. So for me, that was what first got me into preventing violent extremism. Fast forward a few years, I'm writing my master's thesis on fragile and conflict context, specifically disputed territories, and what are the identities of a terrorist, what causes terrorism, what's the psychology behind it, and basically the essence of my thesis was both political and economic factors contribute to why high levels of political instability, low levels of education and economic access have a ripple effect on what causes terrorism. In addition to the psychological and social movements. And it was really looking at disputed territories. So that was the first part of the answer. And the second part, fast forward a few more years, well into my career, I was a very young mom. My baby was a young baby. She was 5 months, and I was in Cameroon at the time, and I was working on the Boko Haram conflict in Cameroon, and I came across this data point, and it was a data point from UNFPA, and it always makes me a little bit sad, and this is why I do it. It said, women in Cameroon from the age of 2 months to 80 plus years old experience multiple forms of gender-based violence multiple times throughout their lifetime. And when I read this, my baby was in my thoughts, and she was my first. So I held her close and I was like, oh my gosh, I need to fight not just for you, but for every child and every adult and every person that ever goes through this, because I'm in a role where I can fight for the women of Cameroon. So I did. I mobilized funds for that. I fought tooth and nail with superiors about why this was important, mainly because, stay in your lane, you're preventing violent extremism. Why are you going into gender? That's the gender team. And I really had to make the argument that in violent context, you go back to Kosovo, you go back to any war, and you can see that the data shows this is an issue, especially for women. And I remember my superiors telling me, my supervisor saying, really, this is not your lane. You really need to sit this one out. And I just getting like really, really like, no, we can't be in a position to help others and just not. So I was successful in mobilizing funds. I think I started that process in March, and by May I had mobilized $125,000 for a gender-based violence roadmap to look at what's happening in Cameroon, especially in the north of Cameroon. And I linked it to violence and violence prevention. And that was where I really saw that saying and standing for what's right can actually have an impact. And I mean, again, it's maybe it was because I was young mom and my baby was so little and I read the data point, but I also felt that when you have the data in that situation, we're already too late. So I didn't want to wait for the data, for evidence-based data in a context where we knew it was happening. So that really made me push for this process. And since then, it really shaped and changed my outlook about preventing violent extremism and counterterrorism, and why gender inclusion and mainstreaming is such a vital part, because we need to be gender sensitive about this. And that's not to say excluding men and boys from the process or marginalized communities, including LGBTQI+, but to actually create a process where there's equity and equality for everybody. I'll stop there. Yeah.
Gazbiah, thank you so much for that already. It was incredibly inspiring as well. And I'm sorry for what your family experienced after September 11th and what unfortunately too many millions of people experienced, both in that context and continuing over the last 30 years globally in too many contexts around the world. And thank you also for not staying in your lane and for stepping up to do what needs to be done in a moment where that is what's called.
Yeah, I think it's one of those moments where you either live to be proud of yourself or you live to improve on what you could have done.
One of the reasons that I love speaking with you and that I so much admire and appreciate your work is you speak very much to what, for myself as well, and for many of us, is our orientation to practice and our orientation to the field. Understanding its significance, understanding that what we are dealing with is actually about people's lives and impacts people. And you mentioned this also, having the agency and the power to act. And if you're in that situation, then the importance of it. Now, before we go forward, I want to also go back and to ask you evaluation. You're working in the PCVE field, you're working on gender inclusion and mainstreaming. How then did this connect, and how did you start working on evaluation within that field?
So I started working in evaluation pretty early in my career, mainly in Afghanistan in 2012 to 14. And I was working on the Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust Fund. And this was something that was surprising for me, because I didn't study M&E. I was learning on the learning by doing, as they say. So I was working in Afghanistan on this, and one of the tasks I was assigned was this: let's do gender inclusion. The donors want it, and it was given to me as a responsibility. My supervisor at the time, she said, we have to do gender inclusion in transport, in all these different sectors, in justice, in so many different parameters. And I wanted it to be meaningful. I think in a context where you have to understand the limitations of the cultural context and what is feasible, what will be championed by the local community. I think this is an important aspect that sometimes get missed in the process, right? But for the most part, when I was in Afghanistan, I was really just straight out of grad school, and I really wanted to test my theories, very enthusiastic. And then I realized, oh my gosh, institutions, right? Bureaucracies. We need to work with them, and to see how best we can use the information and the policies and the processes that are there to advocate for what is necessary for the people who don't have that voice to advocate for themselves. And that's always been a part of my work, is to do advocacy for those that don't always have the opportunity to do that advocacy for themselves, and to understand their context. And I think that listening and understanding the community's needs and the restrictions was a vital part for me. So one of the processes was transport. I think I shared that with you during the last time, so I'll share the one on justice. So with the justice sector, basically they were like, oh, we need to make sure that women can have jobs. Let's find some easy kind of tick the box exercise. And that didn't resonate with me, mainly because it had been 25 plus years where Afghanistan had already been in war. And they didn't have access to education for girls and women. So it had already been a very difficult context. And the more I thought about it, I felt, what kind of jobs would they have? I mean, when I go to the government's office to sit and discuss with them across the table as part of the World Bank team, someone would bring tea, someone would be cleaning, and these were usually men. But what kind of jobs would these women get if we put them in this context? And that's with the additional information that if I as an expat needed to go to the bathroom, the director would say, Gazbiah, use my bathroom. I don't know what would happen to you outside. So all these contexts from people in the country were light bulbs for me that if we created a job for women here, we would have to also create a context where it would be safe for them to work. So creating jobs is okay to say, but if the environment isn't enabling nor conducive, it makes no sense, at least to me. I wouldn't want to work in a context where I would be particularly harmed in a way that was invasive to my personal self, right? That would be a hard environment to return to. So having all these processes in the background, the question is, how do you include gender in an Islamic Republic that is being, and this is pre-Taliban rule, but Taliban influenced. So how do you do that? So after about a couple days of listening to my colleagues discuss, my senior colleagues at the World Bank, country managers, country directors, my direct boss, discuss how do we do gender, I kind of stopped. It was day 2.5, and I said, okay, I have one question. And I directed the question to the director of the ministry, and I said, look, in Afghanistan, the Quran is the book you believe in, right? And he looks at me and he goes, yeah. And I'm like, and it's the word of God. Yes, and we believe everything it's in it, right? And of course the answer is yes. And I said, what if I told you men are mentioned 32 times in the Quran and women are also mentioned 32 times in the Quran? Wouldn't you say that's gender equality? The room got silent and everybody looks at me. My boss is looking at me like, you better know what you're doing. I'm 26 years old. First major assignment, travel abroad for work, and first mission. And my boss is looking at me like, oh my God, I made a mistake. This was the worst hire. We're going to get kicked out of Afghanistan. And the director, he looks at me and he goes, let's stop there. We'll look at it and we'll come back to you. So the meeting closes basically with my statement, and we leave. The whole World Bank team leaves, and my boss says to me, do you know what you're doing? I'm like, don't worry, I know it's accurate. He's like, how do you know that? I'm like, had these conversations with my dad for breakfast almost every day. Growing up Muslim, this was very easy. This is basic knowledge for me, but may not have been for others in the room. So the next day we come back. And from that day on, for the next 2 years I was in Afghanistan, it's Gazbiah Jan. Now, Jan in the Afghan Persian language is someone that it's, a word of endearment. So I was accepted. And he said, now that you've mentioned this and it's been verified, we can endorse this message. So it was a way to push the envelope in a framework that made sense to the local community, where the people who we were talking to is a male-dominant community. How do you get them to empower women? They have to believe it at some level, right? So basically, that's how I got gender inclusion to really be championed from the government side. And after we left and this was approved, people were like, oh my gosh, my team was like, I can't believe you know that. That's so amazing. But it was, again, where we grew up, things that we know, random information can come in and really make a difference in how we can make impact on the ground. So that's kind of how I was able to do gender inclusion, and monitor and evaluation came at a later stage, because the whole idea was the Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust Fund started coming up with these M&E policies, the results matrix, the scorecard, to understand what the World Bank was doing and how we were meeting the targets, and to see if we were making progress, all the rich stuff that M&E does.
Mm.
Now, how was I supposed to get gender inclusion in a meaningful way without setting the tone or the scale or the scene to actually create that? So that's kind of how I did it. And then they were actually able to see progress on the ground from different sectors, because we were then able to say, okay, there's been a shift in the narrative or in the paradigm on gender being included in Afghanistan through World Bank programs. So it was a very special, it was the first time that I realized that it's important to have a voice in these meetings. It's also important to listen and to be observant, because you can't speak knowledgeably if you haven't listened carefully.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that example. And with what you just ended with, and also with the example itself, I'd love to take a moment, if I could, to connect with some of what we're trying to bring forward in the Indeed project, where we're focusing on advancing our understanding and our practice and use of evidence-based evaluation within the field. But we're also focusing on evidence-based policy and evidence-based practice. And at the heart of all of these three is a model that we've come forward with, really being inspired and learning from the medical field and the practice of evidence-based medicine. And it looks at three components. One is best available evidence, internal and external. So what is the evidence that we already have? And you mentioned earlier that if we're at the point where we're getting evidence, it's too late. But one of the points is also a lot of that evidence exists from before. We shouldn't be learning things again the first time. There's evidence from our own experience and internal within our agencies, within our organizations, and there's a vast amount of experience and evidence that has been gathered externally within the field.
Yes.
So best available evidence. The second part is professional experience, expertise, and judgment. And here, some of these lessons and some of the experience that you brought forward, for many people working in various contexts and settings over decades, we could draw similar stories, similar anecdotes. And the question is, should it remain at the level of individual insight, individual experience, individual anecdotes, or how do we go about harvesting that knowledge and those lessons into the field? And the third part also connects with that, and it's stakeholder and community contexts, needs, culture, perspectives, and taking a respect and an empowerment-based approach to engaging with those contexts, cultures, and communities that we're working in. Now, you shared, and this was a common experience for anyone who's worked in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Syria, in many settings, but also I'm speaking with you here from within the European Union, and a lot of what we're focusing on is PVE, CVE work in the European context, where very often the people coming in to do the programming come from one cultural, social, economic, religious, or otherwise background. But the communities, the cultures, the contexts which they're engaging in are often different. Is it okay to have people working in a context and to not know something as basic as the Holy Quran, and to understand or other aspects of people's meaning, identity, culture when engaging with a community?
I think it's okay. It's okay. I think what's important is, when you talk about capturing individual knowledge or harvesting it, I think this is what each individual who works in the sector, that really cares about the sector, They're really passionate about their job and what they're doing to help the larger community of people that are at risk. When you're in this context, it makes sense that you dig within yourself to find your own areas and pull on information you have. So I might not know. When I moved to Cameroon, I was quite new to Cameroon. It was a new culture for me, a new context for me. And Yaoundé, which is the capital of Cameroon, which is where I lived, was quite different than the north of Cameroon, where in the north of Cameroon, it's a centralized government. So the north of Cameroon usually say we're the forgotten north. They feel marginalized as a people. They already had that difference within their community. So again, it goes back to how conscientious you are as a practitioner, how careful listening you have, because the program I was running in Cameroon was called Voices for Peace. Now it's a radio program. We have so every 2 weeks, every week we would do a survey to understand the community feelings and what they were thinking and how we can create programs to mitigate their tensions, intra-community tensions. And a lot of it was herder-farmer issues, but also a lot of it was just, at the beginning, before the Boko Haram kidnappings, and the government of Cameroon didn't fully, and I hope maybe we might need to edit that, but the government of Cameroon didn't want to accept that there was a Boko Haram issue in Cameroon. They kept officially saying that's a Nigeria issue. So there was a lot of transnational terrorism happening between Boko Haram and ISIS West Africa, but also the community was suffering. So I had to really understand that context. And it didn't mean that I couldn't work there. Sure, there were some things that I would have been, if I was a local, I could have learned more. But that's where it's important to have the insider perspective and the outside perspective. I think it needs to work in tandem, because what you learn over here can be applied over here. And to bridge that, you need the local perspective. And this is why community buy-in, community engagement, community-led programs are vital, because the community needs to have their voice and their programs the way that it would be applied in their context. As an outsider, I had to know when to say to my team, this is great information, but you need to dig deeper. When I first started, we had these survey questions that would go out. It would be a few questions, what's going on? It would be some security questions like, how safe do you feel? And then we had to change some of the questions because we needed to understand, we need to go a little bit deeper than that. We need to fully understand who's being affected. Are certain communities being more affected than other communities? And we did find out some communities were more affected, in particular, the Kanuri community, which are visibly identified with their marks on their skin because they have a very tribal tradition of cutting for their culture. And it was because at the beginning of the Boko Haram insurgency, a lot of them joined because of socio-political economic reasons, and they wanted to have an income for their family. So a lot of them joined in large numbers. What this did was the community that stayed got marginalized. And I couldn't fully understand that if I didn't have my local counterparts to give me that information or get that information for me on the ground. But they, there's also this, the fish knows nothing of the water. They would not have shared that information voluntarily for me if I had not created a new set of survey questions to dig deeper. So it's this relationship where we do have to work with each other in the best way possible to foster that information, to get that information, to extract that information that can help practitioners that have varied experience and use the local context to truly get at the root causes or the specific issues that we do try to solve in preventing violent extremism.
And this is one of the lenses that's very important that we're working to bring forward as well. The idea of having multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder engagement at every point when doing evaluations themselves, also to engage community, engage people from different backgrounds who will have those insights to think about and ask different questions than I might have or that someone else might have coming from their background. And also when designing initiatives. I think as a practitioner, someone working in the field, my own answer would have been slightly different in that I completely agree with the value of having people coming from different backgrounds and working in joint teams and the richness that that can bring. But I would also sometimes encourage a little more that if someone is going to work in a culture or in a context which is different than their own, that part of our professional and ethical responsibility and preparation should be to know core texts, important moments in that history, in that context, important elements of identity and values in a community. Because then when someone can be better prepared as you were from your own life experience to be able to bring those questions and those perspectives forward. And it also connects with the issue that within the evaluation field, we have quite often had people coming from a predominance of certain genders, certain cultures, certain backgrounds. And interestingly, designing those surveys without necessarily knowing the right questions to ask to actually reveal the information that we should perhaps be trying to understand.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. I think moving for me personally, moving to Cameroon, and that's something I should have mentioned. It is important to know the context you're moving into, you're going to be working with. You should definitely have a bare minimum understanding, but best practice would probably, ensure that you're just not dropped on the ground without having a dossier that say, here are the milestones these communities have suffered from. This would be best practice.
And some knowledge and information that can help you to.
For every institution or international institution that or donor or developing partner or implementing partner that works in this sector, that should be a best practice. You don't just put somebody in the field, especially an external person, without giving them a basic lay of the land, so to speak. So I think that would probably be something to be implemented globally in terms of a knowledge product that should be presented in larger forums. We need to make sure that when you have an external person going to a new context, they do have that context. I think that's something that's valuable. Absolutely.
And external in these contexts can also be not only in another country, but
Yes.
within our own countries, in a different community or in a different part of that country as well. Now, you've written a recent piece, Gender Inclusion, what it means to gender mainstream in preventing violent extremism and counterterrorism. And in it, you write that it's important to have a genuine basis for understanding the impact of gender inclusion and gender mainstreaming, especially in fragile conflict and violent contexts where women and girls experience acute vulnerabilities, while simultaneously recognizing men, boys, and marginalized communities are also impacted by violent extremism and terrorism. And when looking at that idea of a genuine basis for understanding the impact of gender inclusion and gender mainstreaming, could you share with us your understanding of what is gender inclusion and what do we need to be looking at in the context of preventing and countering violent extremism and counterterrorism?
So when I did this article, it was a couple months ago, and I was trying to find an actual definition for gender inclusion, and it was very hard to come by. It either went very quickly into the operationalization of gender inclusion or gender equality, but then they didn't have a proper definition. So I tried to, with all the information that I was reading, I try to create my own definition, and I come up with something, and it's probably not verbatim as I mentioned it in the article, but something along the lines of, we need to ensure that it's a process where we can ensure that we get to gender equality, but by doing so, we need to be gender sensitive. We need to include policies, programs, interventions, anything at every level that gives each individual a fair opportunity at just being, essentially. And in the PVE, CVE sector, a lot of the processes, and for quite a long time, women and girls were almost invisible in this process. They weren't seen with their agency in terms of being in the violent extremist sector as either a practitioner or as a terrorist or part of a violent extremist organization. They didn't have the agency, or they weren't given an agency to actually do more than being the caretaker of the men, boys in their life. So they were just given this very ignored role where they were not fully recognized. So it's for me, it's just acknowledging that anybody can do anything they want to do. It's something I tell my children. you know so it's quite important to have that mindset at every level, because if we forget that anyone in any capacity can choose any choice, then we're taking away their agency, and we shouldn't be allowed to do that as another person, right? The whole reason we're in development, the whole reason we're part of a sector like this is to empower others. And this is particularly true for women and girls who are often marginalized in these contexts. So I hope I answered your question. I'm not sure if I went on a tangent.
You did answer it, and very well.
And then went on the tangent.
So, but a useful one. But then thinking of it from that lens, from your experience and from the work that you've done, do you feel that practitioners in their work, organizations, agencies, and states in their policies, their funding, their strategies, do they do enough today to understand and to take on board, to apply an authentic gendered approach in, and two parts to the question here, one in PVE, CVE, and de-radicalization work itself, but also then when we are doing evaluation of this work?
So the answer is no to both of those questions. For the first part, no, because I feel that a part of me is like, the gender mainstreaming idea is extremely useful, and it's great that we can have an agenda for gender inclusion. Now, how it's done is problematic, because it becomes a box ticking exercise. This is the example I give you in Afghanistan. Let's create jobs, but how do you do that? That doesn't make sense in that context. It has to be very context specific, and it's not just about writing the information and collecting and gathering data. That's part of it, but it's not the whole story. You really need to. We really need to get a better grasp of how to do it. The gender inclusion idea is good in theory. In current practice, it's not meeting the mark. And that's the sad reality. It's almost like it's this really ironic joke where it's like, how do you kill an idea? Let's gender mainstream it. And it's not funny. It's really dark humor, but like it's not, yeah, but it's also a bit true. And that's why jokes are funny, right? Because there's some humor and truth to the negative consequence or context of it. And I think that's the biggest hindrance it's facing. It's like there's all this energy and effort in this idea of let's gender mainstream, but then what does it actually mean, and how do we actually do it in a meaningful way? Now, if we're being serious about how we can actually do this, then we need to not just look at pie in the sky. what is achievable on the ground. And it needs, we talk about tailored approaches, and tailored approaches need to truly be tailored. It can't just be like, okay, let's make sure gender is in the policy, but then there's one byline or one paragraph that says gender should be included. So, I've read a lot of concept notes. I've read a lot of material. I've read a lot of strategies, and there's always just this one paragraph that says gender or including the M&E aspects. Suddenly, this one paragraph, and then you get to the M&E, and it's like, let's do 50% gender inclusion. We want 50% participants women, 50% men. And it's like, well, how do you jump to that? In a context like, we could go back to Afghanistan since I know it very well. We had this journalism ideation workshop to teach about open data and open information and how to collect information. And so we wanted to work with university students and journalists. Now, again, in a context like Afghanistan, what's the breakdown? You can't possibly get to 50% when the university students are not 50-50 in terms of gender, male-female ratios. So we had about 13 kids, 13 males, 2 females, because that's what we were able to achieve. But if you say 50-50, then you're by definition damaging your own M&E process, right? So it really has to be context specific.
Exactly. That's something that you're coming in with from abroad, but you're not necessarily localizing to understand the actual conditions and context which you're working in. Where you may not be able to get 50-50, but then I would also suggest we could look further at what could be done to bring in authentic voices from communities that are often vulnerable or marginalized or excluded. Maybe you won't find that 50-50 balance within a university or within a cadre of journalists, but you might look at what other steps would be necessary to be able to authentically engage with and hear voices of communities that may be excluded from those spaces as well.
And this is where civil society comes in, because, it's important to, again, have those diverse voices. So for me, the answer is no for both M&E and gender mainstreaming, because we're not doing it in a way, making it systematic is not really a formula that can be applied worldwide. Fine, it can be applied to in theory, document a strategy, and it's one paragraph. We talked about gender, tick the box. But if it's not really getting to the issue and it's not really solving the problems that we're encountering, especially on the ground, because the problem is HQ comes up with this strategy and country teams put the information in that strategy. There's one paragraph. When you and I are on the ground and we're the boots on the ground and we're seeing that what you have in the strategy doesn't necessarily correspond, it takes a long time for the ivory tower to say, aha, or to listen to the person on the ground saying, oh my gosh, this is not working. So,
I think this is part of what's powerful also in this model within the project of looking at evidence-based practice and evidence-based evaluation as ones where you need to engage with professional judgment and expertise and experience from the beginning. And you need to engage with the community's wisdom and knowledge and experience. And we had in another project that we were part of years ago, a process of focal groups in, I think, 17 countries across the European Union, where we were engaging with practitioners working on issues of addressing radicalization, addressing violent extremism and terrorism from many different backgrounds and sectors. We had people from intelligence services, from military, from police and law enforcement, and we had psychologists, social workers, community-based organization, community service organizations. Across the board, though, no matter what sector they were in, one response which came also from every one of the focal groups in all 17 countries was the consistent reality that policies, both at national strategy level, but also often at institutional and organizational level, policies and strategies were being developed with no or profoundly little engagement of the practitioners and the professionals themselves and their experience, sometimes over years or decades, and almost exclusively with no engagement whatsoever of the communities which these policies, targets, and interventions were directed towards.
Right. And I think that's basically one of the biggest burdens you come across as frontline practitioner and being on the ground, is that there's this huge disconnect. And whether the policy was there, whether it's a strategy for 3 years and you're there at year 2, so you're discovering it. But there needs to be this idea, in addition to creating it from the onset, this real-time data that feeds into what we're seeing. We need to really have agile strategies that allow us to say, okay, here's the target, but at the same time, we're very well aware that in fragile and conflict contexts where the urgency of now is yesterday, right? There's a moving target, right? It's a constantly moving target. Not that we want to reinvent the wheel every five minutes or 5 days, but we need to be able to say, hey, there needs to be emergency triggers that we can say at the policy level, and to either get funds for a program that we need that is not earmarked or airlocked to a specific thing, because these donor financed programs are always like earmarked with a specific funding mechanism for a specific thing, and we need it for here, so we can't reshuffle that financing. But it needs to be real-time data to actually address the issues that we're facing on the ground. So the person who's saying, hey, here's an early warning system, they have enough time to actually say, this is happening. We need to start moving now before things go really bad. And I think that's one of the other issues about early warning systems, is that it comes too little too late. And this is why for a long time, it doesn't really, it's always a topic, but it's never really in the forefront. And evaluations come too far at the end after the mistakes have been made. So we need this real-time milestone check that things are going in the right direction. If not, let's regroup, use the current information that we have, and HQ needs to be flexible enough to say, yeah, that's a good idea if we really want to make impact. Right? So it needs, you follow?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And so you're speaking about now in terms of contexts of which are volatile, contexts in which there's conflicts and there's crisis. And that's true in some ways in almost all of our societies also. If you look at a lot of the context around addressing radicalization and extremism domestically here in Europe, those are conflict contexts. There are actual conflicts at the basis, and they are also transnational and dynamic for all the actors and parties involved, from the states and law enforcement agencies to communities. Now, one topic I want to get to in a moment, because you spoke about milestone and real-time indicators and moments to look at how to approach it. In other fields, there's also a tremendous emphasis put on preparedness. If you're working in a field of permanent conflict and crisis, so when we're speaking about Cameroon, when we're speaking about Afghanistan or Nigeria, you mentioned earlier also, all of these are contexts where the crisis has continued over decades, and where the volatility of the context is the context. It's not an unusual moment. It is built into it. In which case, how do we prepare better so that when we are working in these contexts, we're able to actually be addressing the root causes. We're able actually to be designing interventions or implementing evaluations in ways that help us really understand where those changes are necessary in a real time or a learning time approach, so that we don't just keep having it at the end of projects with end phase or summative or final evaluations, but we also make that link, because this is another challenge in the evaluation field. So many evaluations are done, often contracted by consultants brought in from abroad. A report is published, which usually is extremely limited in its reach. It may go to the donor, it may go to a few heads of agencies. It almost never goes to the practitioners. It definitely virtually never goes to the communities that it's actually about. But we're also, and this is a larger question we're looking at in Indeed, the reason we use final reports as the way we bring out materials in the field is because far too often academics are the ones brought in as evaluators, and that's what they know how to do. But the report isn't necessarily a way of formatting knowledge identified and lessons harvested to reach practice and to reach communities or to reach policymakers. So that's one consideration, how we can utilize it better, or also how we prepare so it's not always responding in the moment. I want to connect this with a very powerful line in your piece where you write explicitly that if lived history is an indicator, the current approach to gender inclusion, while seemingly gender inclusive by using a gendered lens, is merely evidencing the lack of action displayed in times of crisis. So my question to you in all of this is, how do we change that? What do we need to do in terms of our approaches, in terms of preparedness, and in terms of practical changes so that all the time and in times of crisis, a gendered lens is meaningfully and mindfully mainstreamed into our practice and into our evaluations?
So, two responses to that. First, it's at there are two levels we have to change it at, right? So this is part of the first response, and then there's the second response. So at the two levels, we really definitely need to start looking at the programmatic level, but also at the implementing level as well. And I can get into the details of that later. And then the second aspect, the second part of that response is we need to be able to identify technical capacity that has or have worked in these types of contexts and that have the know-how versus those that have the theoretical experience, right? So as a practitioner who fell in love with M&E, I'm talking about you, you've been on the other side, so to speak, and then you came to the side that you fell in love with it. Because you have this aspect where you were on both sides of the spectrum at a different point, you know how the other side feels. You know what you need to do today to make former you enjoy what you're doing now, or how it makes sense to you, right? So the idea is, if I have theoretical knowledge only, and my counterpart, I mean, let's say my study life, my master's thesis, it was basically theoretical. And then I got to Afghanistan, and my last 15 years of experience has given me on the ground, like operational experience. So when you put these things together, it creates a different package, right? Where I can see the pitfalls of certain things, and you can see the pitfalls of M&E. Now, if we only have one side of that coin, we need to be paired with people that have the other side of that coin. So it's not that we're battling ideas, but we're enriching them. And I feel that that's what's missing, right? People that know how to work on the ground, because some people have that, they can work in crisis and emergency situation, and others cannot. They will freeze, And some people, they will make it happen. They can think clearly, they know how to do, they have a plan laid out in their head, and they know what needs to be executed in the order it needs to happen. And it's a good thing, but it's also a good thing that the other person who's never worked in that sector on the ground identifies that I can do theory, but I can't be on practice. So we need to find a way to use the knowledge gaps that we know we have, and we shouldn't be ashamed of it. We shouldn't feel scared about it. We shouldn't be, and institutions need to be real about that too. Not everybody's going to be extremely well-rounded, even though it's like an idea that we all want to think that we have. There are things, there are shortcomings each of us have, and we need to be cognizant of that. So we're not selling a product that's half baked or half cooked, because at the end of the day, that's what takes away from preparedness. That's what hinders the progress. And we've seen this. This can be, again, the same example, back to the theory, back to the strategy versus folks on the ground. These are two half-baked ideas like that haven't formulated themselves more naturally. So that's the first aspect, is we really need to know the technical capacity that we have. And in the PVE CVE sector, and I'm all about it, I think it's great. There's a lot of newcomers. I'm saying a journalist turned PVE practitioner for many reasons. There's a lot of different people coming into this sector, and it's great. But make sure that you educate yourself appropriately, because when you and I are speaking about PVE and I use a technical jargon that you're not well aware of, and I have to explain that to you, we need to know that we need to meet somewhere, right? And it's not to say that anybody has superior intellectual superiority over anybody else, or newcomers don't have a role to play. It's not that at all. I think everybody has a role to play. And I really like folks that come in from outside, because they do bring a different perspective. They, just like you and I, coming into M&E or gender from a different perspective based on our own background, it enriches the process. So we need to be able to fully understand and have common ground for the discussions that we have. It's not just jargon for the sake of confusing new people. It's there for a reason. We need to be able to communicate at the basic level, and we need to have that. So in terms of the technical capacity, I think I covered that very well. Now, in terms of the implementation on the ground, I go back to this because I really feel this is the heart of the matter. Communities know what they're experiencing. They might not always be able, like when you're experiencing something, and this is true for anybody in any context, you may not be able to fully articulate what it is you're experiencing at the time you're experiencing it. But after having moments to reflect and think about it, you might be able to better and fully share about that experience. So getting community involvement to help them come to the understanding of what they're experiencing, whether they've perceived a change in the context, or whether it's an experience that they've encountered that it didn't impact them. We really need to start to understand that aspect for on the ground. And we need to have policies and processes that match what the needs are for the ground. And that can only happen if you're in a context where you as a person don't have to worry about that stuff yourself. So I'll give you a very personal example. I told you I was a young mom at USAID. I didn't have maternity leave. I didn't have time off. I was paid, it was leave without pay. And basically, as a young mom, that's like one of the last things you want, right? But long story short, it didn't hinder me from fighting for gender inclusion or any of the things, because I'm passionate and dedicated to the work. But if I knew in the first few months of me having, so I took 5 months off. I think 2 weeks were given or something like this, but then I took some extra time off because we had to move back to Cameroon with the baby, but she needed to have vaccinations ahead of time. Anyway, long story, but when I finally got back into the office, she was 5 months, and I was doing this study. I was researching gender-based violence in northern Cameroon, because some of the research we were getting from the surveys on the ground I had inklings that something isn't right with the local women. I think there's some taboo about mentioning gender, but they're not really talking. We need to have a women group to discuss. So if I didn't have to worry about that process, I could have gotten on faster with my work program. And that's how I see it. Instead of it taking from March, April, May to get the funding to do it, I could have been advanced if I didn't have to worry about how do I take the time off, the stress levels associated to that. So if the institution, and this is not to really call out USAID, although they should do something about their policies, especially for young moms, it's really just to highlight that if the institution I was working for had a proper mechanism in place where I didn't have to worry about my own self and well-being as well as my child, especially working in a fragile and conflict context, with in the Boko Haram context, I could have gotten this work done faster. It could have been done at an easier pace, you know. So it was it's from that context that you in the article that I write about at the institutional level, these processes need to be fully done for people that are less fortunate, that can't take the time off or would then be a little bit, blocked from getting that type of work done. So it's from a very, I write in a very personal way, even if it's not very clear, if it doesn't even come out that way, but it's really from a place of having gone through lived experiences. And I feel that it's an honest work because I cannot be the only one that has suffered through this process as a woman in the sector, a male dominant sector, as a young professional coming in, where the first thing hiring managers think about is, well, how old is this person? Is she going to be married and have kids? And then we'll have to think about maternity leave, which are some of the practices that, hinder women's progress and equity and inclusion as well. So even from that perspective, working to help other women, if a woman is not in a context where she feels empowered enough for herself, she might lose her voice. So some of this, so the second part of that is mainly like, we really need community input, but also at the institutional and international level, we need to make sure that the institutional level have really thought about what this means for employee retention and for progress on the ground.
There's so much packed into your answer. And I just want to really appreciate that you do write about it and that you do say it. And I think that we do need to call ourselves out and to call out agencies and organizations, because we can't be putting gender mainstreaming as a motto, a slogan, a principle, a value, a goal, and talk about it in our work and fund various activities if we don't authentically look at how to put that into practice in our work and in our organizations and institutions. And by naming it, by calling it out, we both, you in your work in writing and ourselves and artists, we speak a lot about power and power in structures, and also often people that may be disempowered. And I think it is for those who have that agency, who have that courage, who have that space, we need to do that job and that work of bringing this forward. And thank you for doing that. Earlier, you spoke of people with different roles, different backgrounds, and it is also so important to create a space where people that are entering into the field and entering into practice feel supported, feel encouraged, feel safe to do that. And I think that came forward in what you're saying as well. And I would also say at the same time, I have two young children that I love. I don't want to bring my children to a surgeon on an operating table who has only gone through a weekend course or who will learn from the experience. In that field, we expect
Exactly.
honesty, integrity, and professionalism in learning. And I think so much of the challenge in our field is this inconsistency and is the lack of actual competence and people bringing forward real competence. So creating supportive space, and that's not just true of new entry, that's true of people that have been in it for 20, 30, 40 years. There's often a complete absence of competence for the actual field, as well as both from new entry and people that have been in for years, a lot of experience, a lot of wealth that can be brought, and how we support that. And this is where one of the areas of evaluative practice that is developing is a lot more emphasis on and focus on collaborative approaches to evaluation, going beyond not necessarily best fit or fit for the field models of external consultancies or experts coming in, but really doing at the beginning a mapping of the stakeholders that are necessary to involve, that have voice, that have a right to be involved. Also mapping stakeholders in terms not only of who do we go to ask questions, but who should be deciding what the questions are. Not only who we choose to interview when we've made the decision to do an evaluation, but who should be deciding when evaluations need to be done and what needs to be looked at. And there's an actual, the Indeed tool, which has been created and it's on the platform. And at every single step of the way, it's a hands-on tool that can be accessed. Agencies, practitioners, scholars, academics, evaluators can engage with and use it, communities. And when you're going through the different stages of evaluation, it also is always bringing up what in the project we call JELSA, gender, ethical, legal, and societal aspects at every point, and stakeholder mapping and stakeholder engagement. So the importance of collaboration. I also just wanted to tease out when you were speaking about creating spaces and the fact that very often in an organization, people have so much on their plate. And in communities, when we're dealing with these issues, there's so much we're going through. This is also one of the areas where evaluation can play such an important role. Not as the top-down expert-based evaluation coming to tell people what is wisdom, truth, numbers, and knowledge, but what more and more is coming forward in the field, facilitative evaluation, where the evaluation creates the space for practitioners, for communities to be able to reflect, to be able to have voice and bring forward their truths. And a very interesting lens that Michael Quinn Patton and others bring forward is also not only always focusing on the outputs, the results, the deliverables of evaluation, but understanding the process, the evaluation process as space of learning and space that helps to address sometimes these power issues. So a lot that came forward in what you were sharing, and thank you for that.
I think this space is quite important. At the World Bank, there's this knowledge exchange. There's this program that is a technical assistance kind of program, and you have two countries in different contexts, and you put them together so they can learn from each other. I think I've always thought this was a very innovative process, but can still be improved upon. And I think we need more of this in the M&E space because it's lacking in the M&E space. We can learn about what you've done. You can learn about what I've done, but how do we capture that knowledge in a context that is constantly evolving? And we need to find ways to initiate these discussions, and these spaces would allow us to do that in order for us to get to a better tomorrow for these projects today, right? And so the idea would be if you had similar programs or opposite programs, and we do this at GSERF, we have these community of practice meetings where we hear from different groups about what they're doing on their side, because you might be stuck in your corner trying to figure something out, but your colleague have already done that, or
Exactly.
their experience might trigger a thought in you that it might not be the exact fit, but you can remodel it to your context and your situation. You can localize that process. So these kind of ideas, these kind of programs, I think we need that space to learn from, again, like you said, new and old, but not in terms of age, but to the sector. But it's also important to recognize that we in the PVE sector, it's the most unique sector in that we have returnees or formers. And a lot of people find this very controversial for fear of past lives, et cetera. But we need to acknowledge that this is a space that it's the only space where you have a former that can have a platform. And it's very unique to our sector. We don't have other sectors where you have someone that was reprimanded in some capacity that can come back and be an educator or build in the sector. So this is a very unique thing to our particular breed and sector of people. We're very open-minded, I think, in our sector. And there might be people that are not within our community, but for the most part, we have accepted a lot of returnees to learn from their programs, to learn from what their experiences. And again, lived experience is informing programs. So we're a different sector than most, right? Because you don't have in the gender-based violence a perpetrator coming back and saying, hey, well, I'm sorry, let me teach you how to not get SGBV'd. That doesn't happen. That would be.
Although actually, interestingly, so I was engaging and thinking through this and what you were mentioning, and I think it is a richness within the field of working to address and understand violent extremism and de-radicalization. I think we can go further on engaging with that authentically and not only as a token. And at the same time, you do actually have contexts where men who have been domestic abusers and who have been violent have gone through processes where they've understood how horrible that has been and where they have authentically taken that on and changed. And we've begun to recognize in the field of addressing gender-based violence that sometimes we need spaces where those men are speaking to other men who are in that space now and can open. We have, in dealing with armed movements, there was an amazing event that was organized by a very good friend of mine, Joe, in the UK, and it was on the 30th anniversary of the Brighton bombing. And they brought together formers from extremist organizations, including state military and gangs and armed movements. And they were looking, so you had organizations like Veterans for Peace or soldiers who've recognized the incredible killing and death and destruction that they've caused and needing to speak about that to learn actually intelligent and effective approaches to addressing conflicts. You've had gang former members who are now involved in programs for helping. So I so appreciate your bringing that forward into PVE, CVE field. And I think it is something we're seeing more and more. And then again, I mentioned learning from evidence-based evaluation in medicine. In medicine, increasingly, you're also having survivors. So for example, cancer survivors who are sharing their experience and working to make the practice of medicine better. And again, in looking at evidence-based evaluation and evidence-based approach, this respect and authentic engagement with stakeholders, with communities, and the need to involve them. Gazbiah, I know that we could, oh, please, yeah.
Forever. I just wanted to say, in the article I mentioned, the Ukraine article on gender-based violence, that's something I advocate for. When we talk about gang violence and men coming from domestic abuse and speaking to other folks, and we really need to do the gender aspect of that. For gender-based violence, one of the things I thought about was, in PVE, we do have this context where a former can speak. Why don't we have enough survivors speaking about this issue? And it's like in PVE, it's not a stigma. If you're a former, you can communicate. And we need to understand if this is because we are promoting or mainly male formers have been promoted, because for the moment we don't have very many female formers that have been promoted, for many reasons, right? But we need to have more of a gender aspect on this as well, to see who's doing the talking, why are they empowered to do the talking, make sure it's diversity and inclusion as well, particularly for gender aspects, but also for SGBV. There's this significant stigma. If you've experienced it, you're not a champion of that work. You're not a champion of your survivor story. You're not out in the public, you're not going on TED Talks, you're not getting this process that, this is why I feel it's extremely unique to PVE.
Within the
And
people.
our sector can extrapolate some of this information and teach other sectors, because, and in particular for GBV, I feel we need to get survivor-centric approaches where survivors are actually at the center of those discussions. And the article I had mentioned at the beginning of our conversation talks about this, because one thing, in one of my very first articles, I got some feedback where it was like, this was great, it's super dense. I was waiting for more. What are we going to do about it? I was hanging on the last word, and then there was a conclusion, and it was great, but what do you think we should do? So now I started including what we should do. But yeah, so I really would like if we can get some of this stuff out, because I think it's something to highlight. And I did that in the Ukraine article, where I highlight what PVE Works does, play on words for my business, and what the gender-based violence program does. Or what it's lacking, and how we can learn from our own processes, even though it's a new sector to some extent. It's only been, what, 20 something years since 1999, 24, 5 years. So it's pretty young. We're still learning, but we're also miles ahead in some ways, where the majority of us have accepted formers, and it doesn't have a stigma, which is in principle amazing. Right. And I don't think we recognize that achievement in of itself. So we should apply that to other contexts.
Absolutely.
I love chatting with you too. Thank you very, very much. It's almost 7.
It is. I was actually just about to say, Gazbiah, thank you. Many of our interviews are 20, 30 minutes, and you've been so generous with your time, and I really appreciate it. It is always wonderful to engage with you. I want to say thank you also, first and foremost, not just for the interview, but for the work that you're doing and the integrity that you bring to it. You're someone that we admire and appreciate tremendously. And it's really been a pleasure to be able to have this conversation with you. Thank you so much for it.